In the early summer of 1945, the United States was on the verge of wrapping up its war with the Japanese Empire in the Pacific theater of World War II. By late June, American fighters and bombers were flying regular missions against military and civilian targets on the Japanese home islands, and it seemed that the question of victory was a matter of time, not possibility. On June 23, 1945, a flight of P-51 Mustang fighters belonging to the U.S. 47th Fighter Squadron took off from Iwo Jima on a mission to attack a Japanese airfield on the country's mainland. These targets were some of the most risky and heavily defended of the entire war, as American forces encountered increasingly desperate and suicidal resistance the closer they came to Japan itself. During the action of June 23rd, one American pilot, Second Lieutenant John Scanlon, was hit in the chest and the abdomen as his P-51 fighter was shot out from under him by a pursuing Japanese aircraft. Although he managed to bail out of his rapidly disintegrating fighter, Scanlon's ordeal was far from over. For one, there were his already serious injuries that would render chances of making an escape extremely slim upon reaching the ground. That ground itself was located in hostile territory, whose inhabitants and garrisons would not take kindly to a downed American airman who had just been strafing targets in their country itself. Moreover, there was always the terrifying possibility that he might not even make it to that point. In the age of gunfighting aircraft, it was not unheard of for a pilot to be shot in his parachute by enemy aviators as he descended through their skies. To prevent this from happening, Scanlon's wingman circled his parachute, staying in the fight long enough to protect his comrade as he descended, alone and badly wounded, into enemy territory. Upon landing on the Japanese mainland, Scanlon was quickly captured and brought to a Japanese military base near the town of Sarawa in Chiba Prefecture. For an Allied soldier to be captured by the brutal Japanese forces was a world-class nightmare in and of itself, but as it turned out, he did not have to worry about spending months, weeks, or years of mistreatment and confinement in Japanese custody. This was because the Pacific Theater would be over in a month, unbeknownst to him, but more immediately, it was because his own fate had already been decided. The fact that an American fighter pilot had been shot down did not escape the notice of many Japanese civilians near the base. Word spread quickly that a U.S. airman had been caught nearby, and in the aftermath of American bombing missions against Japanese cities, a number of civilians were eager to get their hands on a real, live American. A mob, consisting of at least 200 people, surrounded the building where Scanlon was being held, demanding that the military release the prisoner to them. Whether through pressure, incompetence, or his own malintent, the commander gave in to the wishes of the massive throng of people. Those in the crowd got their wish, and John Scanlon was promptly torn apart by the lynch mob, who brought clubs, any other weapons they could think of, and their bare hands. Japan announced its surrender in mid-August of 1945, and the war was officially over in early September. The Japanese commander who turned Scanlon over to the mob later received 40 years in prison, and at least 12 people were confirmed to have laid their hands or improvised weapons on the fallen pilot, who, if he had lived, would have been just over a month from deliverance.
On Saturday, November 5th, 1983, in the frigid waters of the Great North Sea, one of the most horrifying diving accidents would unfold It would only take mere milliseconds before the lives of 4 divers ended in one of the most gruesome ways imaginable. This is their story. Now, before we dive into the event of November 5th, let's first dive into some information that's relevant to this story. The first piece of information is commercial diving. Commercial diving involves trained professionals who perform underwater tasks within various different industries. Their jobs often revolve around maintenance and repair, with the environments they are placed into being extremely hazardous in nature. Edwin Arthur Coward, Roy P. Lucas, Bjorn Gjaiver Bergensen, and Troels Hellevik were 4 saturation divers working on November 5, 1983 on the Byford Dolphin drilling rig. William Cramen and Martin Saunders were dive tenders on the rig, there to help assist the dive team. The Byford Dolphin was a semi-submersible, column-stabilized drilling rig operated by Dolphin Drilling, a subsidiary of Fred Olsen Energy. The Byford Dolphin was built as a deep-sea driller, being the first of class in the highly successful Aker H3 series, designed by Aker Group and completed at the Aker Verdal shipyard in the year 1974. The rig had the ability to drill a maximum depth of 6.1 kilometers or 3.8 miles, and it could operate at a water depth of 460 meters or 1,500 feet. As a drilling rig, Byford Dolphin was equipped with advanced drilling equipment. For deep offshore sites like the Byford Dolphin, saturation divers are depended upon to repair and maintain the rig, and nothing is more hazardous than those that work as saturation divers. So, what is saturation diving? Well, saturation diving is a specialized diving technique where divers live and work at extreme depths for extended periods of time in a pressurized environment. This allows their tissues to become saturated with inert gases, thus avoiding the need for decompression after each dive. On many oil rigs, constant maintenance is needed. To help you understand this a bit more, say a diver needs to dive 700 feet to perform maintenance. Well, returning from a dive of that depth requires careful decompression, which can take approximately 7 days. It's not feasible to send someone down and bring them slowly back up over such a lengthy time frame. Instead, saturation divers will spend days or even weeks at depth. They spend anywhere from 12 to 16 hours a day within their living quarters. Their quarters are an isolated chamber that's kept at depth where the divers sleep and eat. During the other 8 to 12 hours, the divers will work, performing their dive in what's called the bell. The pressure in the bell is matched to the living chamber. It can then be lowered to the seafloor using an umbilical, which is a tube from the surface that provides breathing gas to the divers. You see, at a certain point, a diver reaches their body's saturation point. The saturation point refers to the moment where a diver's body tissues become fully saturated with inert gases like nitrogen from the breathing mixture at a specific depth. This means that no more gas can be absorbed, regardless of how long the diver stays at that depth. Saturation divers will work for weeks on end with their bodies fully saturated, and once their long, strenuous shift is over with, they will be slowly decompressed over the course of days or even a week plus. In the end, it's extremely dangerous work, but it's work that also pays extremely well, as these particular divers can make upwards of $1,000 a day. Now, for those that wonder why you need to decompress, well, the risk of ascending too quickly from extreme depths can be catastrophic to the human body. To understand this a little better, at depth, the pressure of the water compresses gases in your body, including the nitrogen that you breathe. When you ascend rapidly, the pressure decreases and the compressed gases expand too quickly. When they expand too quickly, it causes them to come out of solution and form bubbles. These bubbles can obstruct blood flow, leading to pain, injuries, and, in severe cases, paralysis or even death. With some backstory and needed information out of the way, we will now dive into the events of November 5th, 1983. At around 3 a.m. that morning, Edwin Arthur Coward and Roy P. Lucas were both getting some rest within the rest chamber section of their living quarters. From reports, they were exhausted after working multiple days of overtime, which included numerous 12-hour-plus shifts. Bjorn Bergersen and Troels Hellevik had just completed a short, couple-hour dive and were within the dive bell as it was being brought back up to the habitat. The bell would be attached to the habitat using a trunk, and both Bergerson and Hellebuck would make their way into the habitat, beginning the process of removing their diving gear. Hellebuck would make his way towards the door, where he began closing the door between the habitat and the trunk. Once completed, the trunk could be depressurized and the bell could then be removed from the living quarters. Now, it's not exactly clear why, as I've seen it reported that one of the diving tenders made an error, and I've seen it reported that a mechanical failure caused a clamp to open. Either way, the clamp that was holding the trunk in place detached before Hellebuck could secure the door inside the living chamber all the way. What happened next happened faster than you or I could even blink. Opening the clamp meant that the chamber system, which was currently under 9 atmospheres of pressure, was now connected to the outside with its usual 1 atmospheres of pressure. Both chambers rapidly depressurized, causing air to rush out of the chamber system with unbelievable force. This explosive decompression was unforgiving and brutal to the men inside the habitat. The diving bell would be blasted away. It killed the diving tender that was standing in front of it and severely injured the other tender. Inside the chamber, 3 of the 4 divers, Lucas, Coward, and Bergerson, were killed almost instantly. The fluids inside the men's bodies would expand rapidly. This caused intense hemorrhaging throughout their bodies. In their last moment of life, their blood began boiling, melting their surrounding fat, which then leaked from their bodies. Hellebuck was standing closest to the door when the clamp released, and his fate was easily the worst of them all. Hellebuck was brutally forced through the small opening in the door, measuring 60 centimeters or 24 inches long. His body was badly dismembered, and his internal organs were ejected onto the deck some 10 meters or 30 feet above the exterior pressure door. To put it simply, it was as if his body exploded. 5 lives were lost in the blink of an eye. The only survivor was one of the dive tenders, Martin Saunders. Martin was severely injured by the diving bell, but miraculously, he would end up making a full recovery. These men died in some of the most gruesome ways imaginable, and in the end, the only silver lining would be that their deaths, at least, came quickly. Following the incident, Norwegian officials initially blamed the deadly incident on human error, placing the blame on the now-deceased William Cramen. However, it was later revealed that the tragedy happened because of faulty equipment. The blame placed on Cramen negatively affected his family for many years, and from my research, a lot of people still tell this story and blame Cramen for making a human error. It's not completely clear, but it seems to me like there may have been some human error on top of faulty equipment. Brian McGlinchey, the diving manager at the International Marine Contractors Association, stated, "The fact that there was no interlock on the locking mechanism was immediately apparent, and now the presence of appropriate safety interlocks on SAT diving systems has perhaps the highest priority of all safeguards. What you've got to do is consider the human being in the system and not put those persons in a position where an understandable human error could lead to very serious consequences. Our safety systems must be designed to be tolerant of human error." The North Sea Divers Alliance, which was formed by early North Sea divers and the relatives of those killed, continued to press for further investigation for many years. In February of 2008, they managed to obtain a report indicating the real cause of what had happened: faulty equipment. The families would sue the Norwegian government, and it ended up taking 26 years, but in 2008, a settlement was finally offered to the families of those lost back in 1983. The Byford Dolphin rig would continue its run before it was scrapped in 2019. It has now been over 30 years since the incident, and the Byford Dolphin disaster is still considered to this day to be one of, if not the worst, diving tragedies of all time. As I always like to do, I want to send my deepest condolences to all the friends and family members of those lost back in November 1983.
Roy Sullivan, born in 1912, first considered a career in the outdoors when he joined the Civilian Conservation Corps, established during the Great Depression. From there, he would eventually become a park ranger after a brief interlude as a fire lookout. What he could not have known when he first embarked on this pursuit was that his profession would expose him to far more than wild animals and fires. In 1942, while working out of a tower in Shenandoah National Park, lightning sparked a fire in the valley beneath him. The fire spread rapidly, causing him to flee the tower, but upon exiting the premises of the lookout facility, Sullivan was struck by lightning, a feeling which he compared to being shocked and scalded at the same time, only much, much worse. For almost 3 decades, his life was relatively normal as he put the incident behind him and he solidified his career path in the Park Service, until things took a dramatic turn for the worse at the end of the 1960s. In July of 1969, a second strike would occur as lightning crossed through the open window of his truck, setting his hair on fire as it did so, knocking him unconscious and nearly killing him as his uncontrolled truck nearly careened off of a nearby cliff. He would also be struck the following year in his yard, in both 1972 and 1973 while at work, with another strike each in 1976 and 1977. The injuries involved were usually minor to moderate, but by the end of the decade, his body was covered by wild, zigzagging burn scars on his back, shoulder, and head from his near-death encounters. In addition to these 7 confirmed strikes, Sullivan would also claim that he had been struck by lightning as a child in the 1920s. However, there were never any witnesses to this event, and it is generally considered apocryphal today by authorities on Sullivan's life. Between these strikes, his wife would also survive a lightning strike of her own while Sullivan was present. These recurring strikes over several decades and people's perception of them took a toll on Sullivan's relationships and emotional well-being, as many longtime colleagues and friends avoided him whenever the weather turned stormy and inclement. Some businesses that knew of his experiences would reportedly refuse to let him enter their premises if the sky became overcast. Many contemporaries viewed him as cursed, and some statements from Sullivan seem to confirm that he also thought this of himself. If a thunderstorm approached, he would go to a room in his house away from the rest of his family, or a different location altogether for fear of hurting his loved ones. By the late 1970s, Sullivan was reportedly living in a mobile home surrounded by lightning rods, apparently and understandably paranoid of another freak accident with a lightning bolt. By the end of his life, he had survived a total of 7 lightning strikes on his own person, 8 if counting the unverified strike in his childhood, and he had witnessed a total of 9 if one includes that story and the one involving his wife. Yet it would not be the lightning that eventually concluded his time on Earth, but rather his own hand. He died of a self-inflicted gunshot wound on September 28, 1983. Given normal life expectancy, the odds of a person falling victim to even a single lightning strike are 1 in several thousands. These are, however, only broad trends, and the experience of Roy Sullivan ought to be instructive that no one of us is permanently immune from becoming an exception to the rule. He has since been recognized by Guinness World Records as the man to have been struck by lightning more times than any other. Charles Stevens was a barber by profession, but his true passion was for stunt performance, a trade vastly more dangerous in the past than today. In his native city of Bristol, He was infamous for such stunts as jumping out of hot air balloons with a parachute, a very faulty, risky, and new technology at the time, but hardly the stuff of global legend. After his initial escapades, Stevens was looking not just for another risk-laden gig, but something that would make his name live forever and bring him enough money to support his large family. In 1920, when he was 58 years old, he decided to embark on his most challenging feat yet, to ride over Niagara Falls inside of a barrel. Like his predecessors, Stevens decided to go over Horseshoe Falls on the Canadian side. For all intents and purposes, Horseshoe Falls is the face of Niagara Falls, the largest of its 3 waterfalls, and the place where 90% of the water that they carry tumbles into the gorge below. With risk, bravery, and experience came planning and precedent, and for that reason, Stevens felt confident of success in this endeavor. The stunt had already been completed by 2 other enterprising daredevils within his lifetime, both of whom survived their encounters. However, the most recent attempt by a man named Bobby Leach had been delayed, hampered, and nearly fatal due to the problems of navigating a light, unguided barrel down a raging river, and Leach had very nearly drowned before even getting close to the falls themselves. Stevens intended to have no such navigational difficulties. Where Stevens differed from his contemporaries was his idea to put a 100-pound metal anvil at the end of the barrel where his feet would be, in order to weigh the barrel down in the river and prevent it from being thrown off course before reaching the gorge. Leach cautioned Stevens against using an untested device with such a built-in and obvious hazard. Stevens, however, was convinced that he knew better, and on July 11th, 1920, the moment of truth arrived, and Stevens strapped himself in, had the barrel sealed from the outside, and began his voyage downriver towards the precipice. As his improvised vessel went over the falls, it underwent a drop of 188 feet before reaching the bottom. The bottom of Horseshoe Falls is a nightmare where the waters of the largest waterfall in North America meet the churning waters of the Niagara Gorge, and which crush, submerge, or drown anything caught between them. The convergence between the two is also the deepest part of the Niagara River, roughly 50 meters in depth, and littered with sharp rocks and boulders that would shred a human body on impact. Just slightly downriver are Class 5 rapids, the second highest ranking assigned to such phenomena, and which have killed many attempting to navigate them. Given the hazards at that location, an underwater survey of the waters there has never been completed, and it was this environment into which Stevens was plunging headlong. The barrel in which Stevens was riding was shattered upon reaching the bottom of the Horseshoe Gorge, but it did not break all at once. As Stevens's barrel arrived at the bottom of the falls, the metal anvil strapped to his feet was too heavy for the flimsy container, and it punched out the bottom of the barrel. Based on how he entered the vessel, Stevens was still strapped to the anvil by his feet and to the opposite end of the barrel by his arms, while being suspended in the center by a harness, all of which were precautions intended to help his body absorb the impact at the bottom. Sadly, it was not to be. As the anvil crashed through the bottom of the barrel, Stevens's right arm was torn out of its socket, meaning that he was likely bleeding to death as he drowned, unable to break the surface or swim to safety, even if he made it back up. The missing limb was still stuck in one of the straps, indicating that what remained of Stevens's dismembered body had been pulled right out of the barrel, still conscious, and into the frothing, crushing waters below the falls. The weight of the massive anvil then pulled him down to a watery grave from which the rest of his body has never resurfaced. Despite his demise, it has not stopped the falls from attracting daredevils the world over into attempting similar gambits. Over 10 million people visit Niagara Falls each year, but not many are aware that somewhere in the wondrous spectacle, the unrecovered body of Charles Stevens lurks in the depths under the water, along with the thousands of others who have died on the falls through failed stunts, everyday accidents, or through taking their own lives.